Today, I will deal with right against exploitation, which is one of the most important pillar for preservation of human dignity. We shall try to explore as to how independent India has sought to emancipate its people from being exploited unduly and being subjugated to other environmental, domestic, or other work hazards. The right against exploitation is one of the most vital or important right for the people of India. The right aims to protect the citizens of India from any sorts of exploitation and any sorts of hazards. Article 23 and 24 of the Constitution are designed to prevent exploitation of men by men. These rights ensured by these two articles may be considered as complementary to the individual rights as ensured by Article 19 and Article 21 of the Constitution. The Constitution prohibits trafficking, forced labor, and seeks to protect children below the age of 14 years from working as bread earners. Articles 23 and 24 of Indian Constitution thus safeguard individuals as well as women and children against exploitation of various forms. Like it is designed to abolish human trafficking and beggar. It tries to abolish employment of children below the age of 14 years. It prohibits beggar practiced in the past by the landlords, and it treats human trafficking and beggar as crime and punishable by law, and it prohibits slave trade, prostitution, and any other forms of servitude. Thus, the scope of Article 23 is wide enough to cover under its purview all forms of exploitation. Thus, for example, if the landowner forces a landless labor to render free service, even if against non-payment of debt, even then this is punishable by law. Article 23 thus declares that slave trade, prostitution, and human trafficking are punishable offences. However, it also declares that nothing in this article shall prevent the state from imposing compulsory service for public purposes. And in imposing such service, that state shall not make any discrimination on grounds only of religion, race, caste, class, or any of them. Now, let us discuss what is human trafficking. The meaning of human trafficking is sort of compelling people into servitude, slavery, or prostitution, as well as forcing women, handicapped people, and children to render free services, which goes against basic values of humanity. Thus, human trafficking is equivalent to the act of tricking, luring, or forcing a person into leaving their home to work for little or no payment. It is a sort of modern day slavery. In human trafficking, people are bought, sold, and traded. When there is human trafficking, the people who are being trafficked, they are rarely fed, they are rarely washed, and they get no medical attention. They are often being beaten, raped, or drugged. Their passports may be confiscated and they live with fear. And these are the areas like India, Sudan, Ukraine, these are the areas where human trafficking occurs the most. Let us now focus on Indian initiative to combat the threat of trafficking. First of all, we have already talked about Article 23, which prohibits any sort of human trafficking. However, I have already discussed that there is an exception. For example, compulsory military conscription is not covered under this provision. Article 24, it says, no child below the age of 14 years shall be employed to work in any factory or mine or engaged in any other hazardous employment. Thus, child labor is considered gross violation of the spirit and provisions of the Constitution. What is exactly child labor? Child labor is sort of labor when a child is being forced to work without his or her will in a factory or in domestic sector or in any hazardous work. What happens to the child? They suffer from social exclusion and discrimination. They are kept out of school and forced to work. Child labor thus includes work performed by children under the age of 14, long hours of work on a regular or full-time basis, which denies them their right to develop with their full self. They are denied their right to go to school. They are treated abusively, and they have no access or very poor access to education. How does child labor harm a children? Actually, when the families, they are not being able to support a child is forced to give his or her labor. They may be forced to collect materials from the dumps, recycle them for a small amount of money. They are being constantly exposed to harmful gases, and without proper footwear, they may cut their feet with sharp objects. UN statistics suggests that of the 250 million child laborers worldwide, it is estimated that at least half of them work in agricultural sector. The work is physically demanding because the children can bend down, kneel, climb ladders, carry heavy loads of fruit and other things. Children who work in the agricultural sector, they are actually the worst sufferers because they suffer from back pain and they are prone to get severe injury for using sharp objects or tools like rakes, hoes, shovels, etc. These exposure to dangerous tools may harm the children and even may take their life. If we look at UN statistics on trafficking of children, we can see that United Nations estimates that 2 to 4 million people a year are being traded against their will into some form of slavery, be it domestic labor, begging or prostitution. According to United Nations, most of them are children. Now, trafficking of child involves their recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, receiving children. The means adopted are abduction, sale, use of force, threats, deception, abuse of power or authority. Why there has been an increase in child trafficking? General increase in the demand for prostitution by children, vulnerability of children living in poverty, inadequate legislation and weakness in implementation of the laws, lack of effective services and policies. Who are being trafficked? Mainly girl children from ages 4 to 17 years, children from rural and urban areas in search of work for survival, children who have left home because of poverty, children who have already been sexually abused, children who have run away from places of safety. Who are the traffickers? Parents, mainly mothers, family members, old sex workers, gangs, brothel owners, syndicates and agents, local and foreign nationals. main cause of child labor and child trafficking is poverty. Poor families need to keep as many family members working as possible. Therefore, they employ their children in hazardous works. And this makes it very difficult for the children to get proper education. In fact, educating a child can be a significant financial burden for these families. 191 countries agreed to recognize the right of children to be protected from economic exploitation. Now, what are the initiatives of Government of India? We have already talked about Article 24. There are enough legislations. There are national policies, legislations. There are better law enforcement techniques. Training and capacity building mechanisms have evolved. Special anti-human trafficking units have been set up. But the most significant step taken by Government of India is insertion of Article 21A. Article 21A suggests that the state shall provide free and compulsory education to all children of the age 6 to 14 years in such manner as the state may by law determine. It is in tune with Article 45 of the Directive Principles of State Policy, which said that the state shall endeavor to provide within a period of 10 years from the commencement of the Constitution for free and compulsory education for all children until they complete the age of 14 years. Thus, these provisions have been inserted with a view to make people conscious of their rights, which can be channelized through proper and basic education. These articles were designed as a means of proper socialization of the children within their families. However, there are several, as we have already discussed, that there are several constitutional provisions. But is this enough? No, this is not enough. Therefore, Parliament has enacted number of laws. Let's start with the Bonded Labour System Abolition Act, which was being enacted in 1976. Bonded Labour System Abolition Act 1976 was enacted for abolition of bonded labor system for protection of economic and physical protection of economically and physically weaker section of the society. There was a provision of vigilance committees for execution of the law. It was stated in the act that whoever, after the commencement of this act, compels any person to render any bonded labor shall be punishable with imprisonment for a term which may extend to 3 years and also with a fine which may extend to 2,000 rupees. And after that, a number of legislative initiatives have been undertaken at both central and state level. The major national legislative developments include the following. All these legislative enactments actually were supposed to protect not only men, women, but also children from being unduly exploited. The Factories Act 1948. The Act prohibits employment of children below the age of 14 years. An adolescent between 15 to 18 years can be employed in a factory only if he or she obtains a certificate from a competent medical officer. The Act also prescribes that such an adolescent can never be forced to work for more than 4.5 hours, and he will not work at night hours. Minimum Wages Act 1948. It prescribes minimum wages for all employees in all establishments, and it also provides for minimum wages to those working at home in certain sectors specified in the schedule of the Act. Central and state governments can revise minimum wages specified in the schedule. Some considered that this Act is an effective instrument to combat child labor, so that the child is not being hired for being less costly. The Mines Act 1952. The Act prohibits employment of children below 18 years of age in a mine. It states that apprentices above 16 may be allowed to work under the supervision of a proper guide in a mine. The Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act 1986. In pursuance of India's development goals and strategies, a national child labor policy was adopted in 1987. And this was adopted following the Act of Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act 1986. It reiterates the directive principles of state policy as enumerated in the Indian Constitution. It resolves to focus on general development programs to benefit children wherever possible and have project-based action plans in areas of big concentration of child labor engaged in wage or quasi-age employment. Juvenile Justice Care and Protection of Children Act 2000. This act was last amended in 2002 in conformity with the UN Convention on the Right of the Child. It was designed to protect children below the age of 18 years. Section 26 of the Act deals with exploitation of a juvenile or a child employee and provides in relevant part that whoever procures a juvenile or a child for the purpose of any hazardous employment and keeps him in bondage and withholds his earnings or uses such earnings for his own purposes shall be punishable with imprisonment for a term which may extend to 3 years and shall also be liable to pay fine. In some states like Karnataka, Maharashtra, this provision has been used effectively to bring to book many children, many child labor employees who are otherwise not being covered by any other law, or to give relief and rehabilitation benefits to a large number of children. The Right of Children to Free and Compulsory Education Act 2009. This act provides for free and compulsory education to all children below the age of 14 years. This legislation also envisages that 25% of the seats in the private schools should be allocated for children from disadvantaged sections, including differently abled children. Let us look at some policies and programs. First, among all these policies are national child labor projects for rehabilitation of child workers since 1988. The Ministry of Labor and Employment has been implementing the national policy through the establishment of NCLPs for the rehabilitation of child workers since 1988. The objective of such policy was to establish special schools, including vocational training centers, to promote additional income and employment generating opportunities for the families, and raising public awareness. A renewed commitment to fulfill constitutional mandate resulted in enlarging the ambit of NCLPs in 1994. It sought to rehabilitate children working in hazardous occupation in child labor endemic districts. The strategy for the NCLPs includes the, as I have already said, includes the establishment of special schools as well as conducting surveys and evaluations of child labor. Most significantly, the central government made a budgetary allocation of 2.5 billion for these projects during the 9th five-year plans. Around 100 NCLPs were launched across the country during this period. During 2001-2, the government launched Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, or Education for All program, and it designed to provide universal elementary education of satisfactory standard by 2010. During 11th five-year plan, expansion of NCLP scheme was initiated. Substantial improvements in the quality and standard of education and teacher training was sought for, and it also tried to seek amendment to all laws which were designed to protect children below the age of 14. Actually, it tried to include under its purview the children below the age of 18 years old. Apart from this, India has joined international initiative like International Program on the Elimination of Child Labor, and IPAC launched a convergence project against child labor which covers 5 states: Bihar, Gujarat, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh and Orissa. The project is expected to demonstrate effective convergence-based models for elimination and prevention of child labor, including trafficking. There are certain institutional efforts like V.V. Giri National Labour Institute and National Institute of Rural Development and certain state-level institutions which have played an important role in the areas of training and capacity building of government functionaries, factory inspectors, officials of Panchayati Raj institutions, etc. for abolition of child labor. India has signed certain treaties like ILO Forced Labor Convention number 29, ILO Abolition of Forced Labor Convention number 105, UNO Convention on the Rights of Child CRC. We have recently seen that Malala Yousafzai and Kailash Satyarthi have received Nobel Prize for fighting against child labor as well as fighting for the right of children to have proper education. So, we must remind that it is not only the duty of the government, neither the task should be left alone with legislations, constitutional provisions, etc. It is the citizens of India, residents of India, who must raise voice against any sort of exploitation of men by men and specially against child labor. Thank you.